Close the door, kill the lights, and come closer. Do you smell that? It's the ozone tang of old aircraft fuel mixed with something metallic and cold, like an empty server room that's been running 24/7 for a decade, generating an impossible amount of heat and silence. It reminds me of the hangar where I spent most of my professional life, auditing the impossible gaps in the air traffic control logs. You trust the aluminum shell outside, but you forget that the sky itself is a breach. We think of the atmosphere as empty space, but sometimes the void stares back. If you hear a knock, don't answer it. What I'm sharing tonight are fragments, files I stole from a classified internal FAA audit known only as the Altitude Anomaly Files. They are 9 distinct ruptures in reality, all occurring miles above the Earth, where the systems are designed to be perfect. The common thread? Every time a plane touches the shadow of the void, someone is taken, and the records are instantly scrubbed clean. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are right now, and what time the dread is hitting you. Headphones on, world off. The nightmare is waiting. If you're still awake at this hour, you already know why. Do you hear that? It's the faint, high-pitched ping, ping, ping of a smoke detector with a dying battery, echoing in a house that's otherwise completely silent. That sound, that desperate, ancient signal, is what the void sounds like when it's trying to communicate. It's an auditory anchor that reminds you something is failing, something essential is slipping away right now, even if you can't see it. The darkness we chase isn't just the absence of light. It's the collapse of all reliable systems. Don't look behind you right now. What I pulled from those altitude files wasn't about mechanical failure or pilot error. It was about erasure. Tonight, we start 35,000 feet up, somewhere over the vast, uncaring Midwest, aboard a flight that should never have existed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are right now, and what time the dread is hitting you. Now, dim the lights, let the silence settle in, and let's step into the dark together. The flight was Ether Airways 707, a red-eye from Seattle to Miami, scheduled to cross the heart of the continent in the deep hours of perpetual midnight. I remember Arthur Vance, a name logged briefly, tragically, in the manifest system. Arthur was tired, the kind of exhaustion that makes the cheap vinyl seat feel like a necessary coffin. He noted the emptiness of the cabin as he boarded. Perhaps 10 passengers total, scattered across a wide-body jet designed for 300. The flight attendants, pale and weary, moved with the slow, deliberate exhaustion of people who have seen too many dawns from too many time zones. Arthur found his window seat in row 27. He didn't speak to anyone. He just buckled in and let the sound of the idling turbines vibrate him toward unconsciousness. It was the silence that woke him, not just the lack of noise, but a profound, engineered silence that pressed against his eardrums like physical force. He blinked. The cabin lights were at minimum setting, that sickly orange-gold glow that makes every shadow look like a disease. Arthur glanced at the window. Blackness, impossibly deep, without the reassuring pinpricks of ground lights or the sweep of the navigation beacon. We are taught to fear turbulence, the violent shaking that reminds us of the planet's vast, indifferent power. But the deeper terror is perfect stillness. He looked around. Empty. The plane was sailing through the air, but the hum, that deep, constant physiological thrum of a machine fighting gravity, was gone. The engines were silent. The air conditioning was still. The only sound was the distant, faint whoosh of the fuselage slicing through the thin upper atmosphere. Arthur leaned into the aisle. The 10 scattered passengers were gone. Their seatbelts were undone, their blankets folded neatly on the cushions. No sign of struggle, no half-finished drinks, no abandoned books. Just perfect, Impossible order. He walked forward, his footsteps deafening on the thin carpet. The galley was deserted. No carts, no rattling cutlery, no scent of stale coffee. He checked the cockpit door. Locked. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us. Arthur's mind, trained by years of rational experience, desperately searched for the explanation. Mass medical emergency? A collective delusion? But the evidence was visceral. He was utterly, impossibly alone. He checked his phone. No signal, of course, but the internal clock was frozen. 1:14 a.m. He checked the digital clock near the forward exit. 1:14. He checked his wristwatch, a cheap quartz thing. The second hand was twitching precisely between two marks, unable to complete its circuit. The flight had entered a temporal eddy, a speculative concept often dismissed by physicists, where reality briefly pauses to realign its vectors. This plane, Ether 707, had drifted into a seam. Arthur fumbled through his jacket pocket and found the disposable camera he'd used to take a pre-flight picture of the Seattle gate. He developed it instantly, a relic of a bygone era, but dependable. He saw the faint outline of the gate, the early morning gloom. But across the glossy image, scrawled in thick, wet red ink that smelled faintly metallic, was a single, perfect command: wake up. The realization struck him with the cold impact of high-altitude decompression. He wasn't just alone. He was the target. Everything, the empty seats, the frozen time, the silent engines, was scenery set up just for him. And then, the silence broke. The pressure stabilized with a soft, hydraulic sigh. The navigation lights outside the window flickered back to life, not the clean white of standard LEDs, but a deep, bruised violet. Below, suddenly, lights appeared, too many, too symmetrical, spread across the ground in a pattern that was mathematically perfect, like a circuit board made of incandescent white. We have a grounding fact here. Extreme, prolonged silence, such as that experienced in the anechoic chambers used for psychological research, can cause profound vertigo, auditory hallucinations, and a complete loss of equilibrium. Arthur was experiencing this at 35,000 feet. The inner ear, deprived of the expected low-frequency drone of the engines, starts to invent noise, to invent reality. But the plane was definitely descending. The landing was surgical. Not a bump, not a tremor. A ghost gliding onto a mirror. Arthur looked out the window as the jet taxied. The terminal was vast, made of polished, black obsidian, lit only by sterile white spotlights. There were no commercial carriers parked anywhere, only identical, unmarked white jets, their tails painted with a simple, silver double helix symbol. And no people. The jet came to a halt. The door hissed open. A man stepped onto the jetway, dressed in the uniform of a ground operations agent, except his jacket was charcoal gray, not high-visibility yellow. He didn't look surprised. He looked expectant. "Welcome to Station Gamma," the man said, his voice flat, devoid of regional accent. "Mr. Vance, you are cleared for disembarkation." Arthur stumbled out, the cold air hitting his face. The air smelled of clean metal and ozone. He turned back to the plane, Ether 707. "Where's everyone?" Arthur demanded, his voice thin in the vast hangar space. "The crew? The other passengers?" The agent didn't pause. He held out a thin, metallic tablet. "Sir, the flight manifest shows only one passenger. Arthur Vance. This was a solo charter. Essential freight delivery, initiated at 1:14 a.m. Arthur protested, trying to recall the faces, the old woman across the aisle, the young man with the laptop. But as the ground agent spoke, those memories began to recede, as if his brain was rapidly archiving them under fiction. "Where's Station Gamma? This isn't Miami." "Location is irrelevant," the agent stated, guiding him toward a glass exit door. "You have completed the transfer. Your original flight path has been reconciled." Arthur tried to take a photograph of the black terminal, of the strange symbol on the jet tails, but his phone refused to operate. Later that morning, Arthur found himself standing alone in the arrivals hall of Miami International, disoriented, clutching his small carry-on bag. There was no record of Ether Airways 707. The TSA had no record of his entry. His credit card statement showed an immediate reversal of the ticket charge. 3 days later, he received a single, encrypted email, Sender Address System Administrator. The body of the message was brief, a perfect digital burial. The incident has been categorized. You have been cleared for memory integration. You may now recover normal memory sequence. Arthur closed the laptop. The memory of the empty plane, the frozen clock, and the red ink felt less like a nightmare he experienced and more like a film he'd accidentally watched. He was back, but the system had confirmed his reality was negotiable. And somewhere, 35,000 feet up, the coordinates of Station Gamma were cycling back into the void, waiting for the next essential delivery. The silence that swallowed Arthur Vance and that ghost flight didn't end when he stepped onto the tarmac in Miami. It merely transferred the signal to the next frequency. It's an insidious, systemic dread, the realization that the air above us is less of a medium for travel and more of a curtain hiding something predatory. And when the curtain lifts, it never fully closes again. My next file concerns investigator Eli Carr. Eli was a seasoned NTSB accident reconstruction expert, a man who believed absolutely in the measurable world, stress fractures, wind shear, metal fatigue. His nightmare began when the measurable world ceased to exist. Borealis Air Flight 919, a routine mid-morning hop from Chicago to San Jose, vanished without a trace on a clear October morning. No distress signal, no sudden drop in altitude, just a clean, surgical incision on the radar screen. It was classified as a routine disappearance, likely a catastrophic hull failure over the Nevada desert, though no debris was ever located. Eli spent 122 days tracking down spurious pings and dead ends, the case cooling rapidly into administrative oblivion. Then, on the 123rd day, the shadow reappeared. It was found exactly where it had vanished, except instead of scattered debris, there was an entire Boeing 787 resting perfectly intact on the blinding, crystalline white of the Bonneville Salt Flats. Not a scratch on the fuselage, not a sign of forced landing or collision. It looked, Eli noted in his report, like a museum piece someone had forgotten to uncrate. Eli was the first on the scene, mandated to document the initial state before the military sweep arrived. He drove across the flats in a modified Humvee, the heat shimmering off the sodium crust, creating mirages of impossible movement on the horizon. When he reached the plane, the sheer improbability of the scene hit him viscerally. No sand infiltration, no sun bleaching, nothing that hinted at 3 months exposed to the elements. It was unnervingly clean. He extended the forward stairwell and stepped into the cabin. The first sensation was the temperature. It was precisely 72 degrees Fahrenheit, the standardized comfort zone for a commercial flight. The air smelled faintly of ozone and warm, stale coffee. But the silence was that same, oppressive vacuum Arthur had described. Eli moved slowly through the aisles, camera already recording. The 43 manifested passengers were gone. Like Flight 707, there was no sign of struggle, but here, the lack of decay was the true horror. On seat 14A, a plastic cup of coffee sat on the tray table. Eli, a stickler for forensic detail, touched it. It was still warm, radiating a gentle heat against his fingertip. The beverage had been sitting there for 123 days, defying thermodynamics. In the aisle, near row 30, a small child's wooden toy airplane was floating an inch above the carpet. It was clearly in the act of falling, the posture of the wings, the slight tilt, but it was suspended, immovable, captured mid-trajectory in an invisible amber. Eli reached out, cautiously. His hand passed straight through the space above and below the toy. It was untouchable, preserved in a moment of perpetual motion. In the galley, a half-eaten sandwich sat exposed on a plate. No mold, no desiccation, the lettuce crisp, the ham perfectly pink. It hadn't spoiled. Eli understood the grounding fact here. Time, as a linear, observable progression, had failed. Biologists theorize about taphonomic distortion, the process of decay and fossilization, which dictates that all organic material must break down. But inside Borealis Air 919, taphonomy had been surgically halted. It wasn't freezing, it was suspension. This wasn't a physics problem. It was a conceptual breach. He found the cockpit. The door was ajar. The instrumentation was dark, but the air felt charged. Eli located the flight data recorder, FDR, and the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, the black boxes. He prioritized the CVR, the final words and sounds of the doomed flight. He brought the boxes back to the temporary field lab set up 2 miles away, the sense of unreality pressing down on him. When they played the CVR, they heard 48 seconds of normal chatter, followed by a blast of white noise. Then, a voice. It wasn't human. Not exactly. It was a modulated hum, perfectly pitched, that resonated deep in the chest cavity, bypassing the ears. When the spectral analysis was run, the computer flagged the sound pattern as non-linguistic, yet clearly communicative. A synthetic, echoing whisper that seemed to speak from the deep vacuum of interstellar space. "This is not your sky." The recording looped. And then, a series of clicks began. They weren't random. A junior analyst, distracted, sketched the intervals onto a notepad and suddenly gasped. The clicks formed the Fibonacci sequence. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. As the sequence continued, the digital output on the monitor warped. The clicks, translated into geometric waveforms, began to assemble into an image. Eli stared, chilled by the meticulous, mathematical precision of the horror. It was a perfect, intricate rendering of the human brain, the limbic system glowing faintly purple. Below the image, the final data packet, a compressed text file that appeared to translate the hum's final command: "Do not return." The greatest failure of science is assuming the laws we observe here are universal. Eli realized he wasn't looking at an accident. He was looking at an archive. The plane had been preserved in its entirety, mid-flight, as an object lesson, a trophy from a reality that intersects ours at high altitude. The speculative concept here is the atmospheric fold, that the plane, instead of traversing time, had simply been held outside of it, in a place where decay and momentum were irrelevant. A dimensional pocket accessible only through certain spatial coordinates. And something, or someone, had returned it as a warning. Within 48 hours, the military arrived in force. The area was classified as an environmental cleanup zone. Eli Carr's report was seized. The plane was immediately wrapped in thick, reflective sheeting and airlifted to an undisclosed location. Eli was debriefed for 72 hours by men who wore identical gray suits and who spoke of cognitive resilience and psychodefense protocol. His findings on the suspended objects, the warm coffee, and the coded black box message were rewritten. The final, official file, the one Eli was forced to sign, stated that Flight 919 had suffered a catastrophic structural failure, and the recovered wreckage was too mangled to yield conclusive results. But Eli knew. He had seen the Fibonacci brain and heard the echo of "Not Your Sky." He received his final communication from the Internal Investigation Unit, an email confirming his forced early retirement, stating simply, "Your exposure to the altitude anomaly has warranted mandatory systemic quarantine." Further inquiry into this file will result in personal security downgrades. Borealis Air 919 was never mentioned again in public records. It was erased. But Eli Carr still wakes up smelling ozone, wondering about the purpose of a flight designed to simply freeze in time. And he knows that somewhere, sealed in a vault, sits a perfectly intact plane, containing a cup of warm coffee waiting for a passenger who will never finish it. The pattern is established, isn't it? Above the clouds, reality becomes pliable. Time stops, people vanish, and the evidence, no matter how solid, is simply erased by an overwhelming, systematic force. The dread compounds when you realize these are not isolated incidents. They are parts of a coordinated aerial harvest. My investigation led me to the third rupture, one that happened not over the salt flats or the silent Midwest, but in the compressed timeline of a short-haul flight, a brief hop across the sun-scorched Southwest. This file is about the agony of proximity, the horror of knowing someone you love is being consumed by the void in real time, 30,000 feet above the desert floor. Meet Sean Elrod. Sean was a systems architect in Phoenix, a man whose life revolved around logic gates and secure networks. His wife, Maya, was taking a quick, 45-minute evening flight, Stellarjet 414, from Los Angeles back to Phoenix. She was scheduled to arrive at 8:50 p.m. Sean was tracking the flight on his tablet, watching the small digital icon move predictably across the map, when his phone buzzed with an urgent text message from Maya. "Sean, something is wrong. The lights are off. It's too cold." Sean frowned. Stellarjet was a major carrier. Short flights always had cabin lights on during takeoff and landing. He texted back immediately, "Are you okay? Is there a delay?" The reply came seconds later, frantic, riddled with typos. "He's staring at me. Row 7. I haven't seen him before. No one is moving." Sean felt a prickle of alarm, but tried to rationalize it. Anxiety, night flight jitters. Talk to the flight attendant. "Honey, tell me exactly what is happening." He whispered my name. "MY. He knows me. I never gave him my name." This detail chilled Sean instantly. Maya's professional life demanded digital anonymity. She used a pseudonym for travel. Only he and a few close family members knew her legal name. The fact that a stranger on a crowded flight knew it was impossible. The messages accelerated, a desperate, real-time chronicle of vanishing reality. The engine sound stopped again. Like last time. The air is heavy. The lights are changing color. "Sean. They're green. He's walking towards me. They are all looking at me now. They are still. He's reaching out. I'm in 12B. The final message was just a fragmented scream, for letters pressed randomly. HGJD, followed by an immediate system notification. Message failed to send. Sean spent the next hour in a state of growing panic, driving to Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. Stellarjet 414 was scheduled to land, but the flight trackers were now showing delayed. When he finally reached the arrivals board, the listing for Stellarjet 414 had vanished entirely, replaced by flight canceled. He went straight to the Stellarjet counter. He showed the agent the thread of text messages. The agent, a young man with practiced apathy, checked his terminal. "Sir, Stellarjet 414 was canceled 2 hours ago due to maintenance issues in LAX. It never left the ground." "That's a lie," Sean stammered, holding up the phone, the time-stamped conversation indelible proof. "My wife was on it. Maya Elrod. Check the manifest." The agent diligently typed the name. The screen flashed the official response. "Passenger name Maya Elrod is not on any manifest for Stellarjet 414, nor is she listed in our reservation system for today's date." Sean spent the next week in a bureaucratic inferno, filing missing persons reports, badgering Stellarjet corporate security. They insisted Maya had never checked in. They provided CCTV footage of the LAX gate at the scheduled boarding time. It showed only a maintenance crew working on the air bridge, no passengers, no agents. He was going insane. He had texts, physical evidence of fear and movement, yet the entire journey, the very existence of the flight, had been surgically excised from the system. The grounding fact here is something called the Mandela effect, a collective psychological phenomenon where large groups of people share a persistent, false memory. But this wasn't collective. This was intensely personal, a manufactured delusion imposed on one man to cover a terrifying reality. The key speculative concept that emerged from this file was the concept of the preemptive capture. What if the flight never existed because it was a phantom? A parallel process initiated by the system, designed solely to ferry specific targets from one point to another without leaving a trace on the conventional grid? Maya's fear was real, the staring man was real, but the flight number was a disposable decoy. The haunting didn't end with the missing persons report. It settled into a terrifying routine. Every Sunday, precisely at 2:07 a.m., Sean's phone would vibrate with a low-priority notification. It was a single, silent ping from his wife's device. A location marker. It wasn't Phoenix. It wasn't LAX. Sean zoomed in on the coordinates on the global map. The signal emanated from the middle of the Pacific Ocean, roughly 1,000 miles west of the Baja Peninsula, a vast, empty expanse of water where no commercial flight routes ever crossed. He tracked the signal for months. Every Sunday, 2:07 a.m. A perfect, unwavering location, always from the same spot. It was a point in the void, a persistent echo that defied logic, GPS calibration, and maritime law. What terrified him the most was the time. 2:07 a.m. He finally checked the initial text chain with Maya, running the milliseconds on the final message failed to send. The message, though unsent, was logged as initiated at 2:07 a.m. Pacific time. The location was not a recent position. It was the persistent, final locus of the plane. It hadn't landed in Phoenix or at Station Gamma. It was parked, stationary, in the middle of the deepest ocean, emitting a weekly pulse as a horrific confirmation. A reflective thought hit Sean one late Sunday morning as he stared at the blue dot on the screen. The void doesn't destroy its evidence. It simply moves it to a place where we are not allowed to look. The Pacific abyss, 30,000 feet deep, was the aquatic equivalent of the salt flats, a vast, inhospitable repository for things that were meant to be forgotten. The final piece of this tragic file was a report detailing the subsequent erasure of the location ping. 6 months after Maya vanished, Sean's phone received a system update from his carrier. The next Sunday, the 2:07 a.m. notification arrived, but when he opened the map, the location was generalized, Western Hemisphere. The coordinates were gone. The system had finally patched the breach, scrubbing the last faint whisper of Maya Elrod and Stellarjet 414 into digital oblivion. But Sean still looks at the map, knowing the empty blue space where his wife's phone used to beacon every week. And he knows that somewhere out there, a silent plane drifts above the waves, and a man in row 7 is still staring. The disappearances aren't random. They are targeted, efficient, and systematically covered. The void doesn't just take people. It uses the infrastructure of commerce to do it. The more I dug into the Altitude Anomaly Files, the clearer it became that the airlines themselves, or the shadowy organizations working through them, were leveraging the high-altitude isolation to conduct deeply disturbing transfers. Our next file involves Dana Roth, a travel writer who prided herself on witnessing the strange corners of global transit. Dana was on a transoceanic flight, Global Air 606, heading from London to Atlanta. The flight was unremarkable: bad food, stale air, the usual 9 hours of manufactured limbo. But the landing was anything but routine. As the plane taxied toward the gate in Atlanta, Dana noticed a profound shift in the ground operations. There were no bright yellow service vehicles or smiling gate agents. The plane was immediately surrounded by identical, unmarked black SUVs, and then a squad of men in tactical military gear, faces obscured, swarmed the jetway. This wasn't a standard security scare. The movement was too fluid, too focused. When the cabin door opened, a severe-looking officer stepped in, holding a digital tablet. The air went rigid. "Attention, passengers," the officer announced, his voice amplified, echoing with harsh authority. "Remain seated. Do not attempt to use cellular devices. This is a mandatory security detail." The tactical team moved with surgical precision, ignoring the rows of stunned international travelers. They marched straight to the back of the plane, to row 32, seats A and B. There were two middle-aged men sitting there, nondescript and silent. The soldiers efficiently zip-tied the men's wrists and ankles, and without a word, dragged them, hooded, off the aircraft. A moment later, two specialized K-9 units boarded, not drug dogs, but dogs trained for biological and forensic sense. They didn't sniff the aisles or the carry-ons. They led the handlers directly to the back cargo bay door. Dana, seated near the wing, felt a creeping, icy dread. She watched the crew members, who had previously seemed bored and detached, now stare straight ahead, their eyes glazed, refusing to acknowledge the armed invasion of their space. When the military finally disembarked, the lead flight attendant, pale but composed, stood up. "Apologies, ladies and gentlemen. That was a mandatory security exercise initiated by federal authorities. There is no cause for alarm. Welcome to Atlanta." Dana was skeptical. She'd seen military presence before, but never this focused, this aggressive. She was a journalist, and the professional curiosity immediately overrode her fear. She started digging. The immediate reports were the standard cover-up, routine security protocol, missing documentation, no threat detected. But Dana had noted the flight number, the day, the gate, and most importantly, the seat numbers, 32A and 32B. Using her contacts in the aviation logistics world, Dana managed to pull the internal maintenance and assignment records for Global Air 606. And there it was. The seat map showed a complete anomaly. For the last 3 months, seat 17C, Dana's own seat, had been flagged in the system with a unique code, Gov Occupied, Non-Commercial Manifest. This was the terrifying grounding fact. The flight was not a public transport service. Dana, and likely most of the other 200 passengers, were non-commercial variables, essentially human ballast. The plane was a discrete, high-altitude logistics platform. The civilian manifest was a camouflage layer, a thick, noisy veil designed to conceal the real purpose of the journey. Dana realized her function. She was a witness who could be easily dismissed, the necessary noise to hide the true, silent, classified movement. But the K-9 unit's focus on the cargo hold led her deeper. She found a fragmented internal manifest for the cargo bay, noting a single item designated T-class biocontainment unit. This led to the speculative concept of the concealed ecosystem. She reasoned that the flight was not moving people. It was moving something else, something highly sensitive, locked away in a specialized biometric container beneath the passenger deck. The men in row 32 were either couriers or, perhaps, guards. They were disposable if compromised, which explained the immediate, brutal arrest. The terrifying twist came when she matched the container's specifications to known records. The T-class unit was not for frozen organs or high-value chemicals. It was engineered to maintain a breathable atmosphere, specific humidity levels, and biofeedback monitoring for an extended period. It was designed to transport life, and it wasn't human life. Dana couldn't shake the visceral dread of the K-9 unit's intense focus. They weren't looking for a bomb or drugs. They were tracking a very specific scent emanating from that black box. The thought occurred to Dana, a moment of paralyzing reflection. We board a plane believing in the shared contract of travel. But what if that contract is just the cover for an entirely different, more terrifying cargo manifest? She pushed too hard. She reached out to the Global Air Communications team with detailed questions about seat 17C and the T-class designation. The response was swift, brutal, and silent. Her personal email account was locked. Her computer crashed, corrupted by a targeted, surgical data wipe. Her press credentials were revoked under a new, arbitrary classification of national security risk. A few days later, she received a physical envelope delivered by a silent courier. Inside was a single, laminated card. It was a digital image of the boarding pass she had used for Global Air 606. Seat 17C. Scribbled in the margin, in the same unsettling red ink that Arthur Vance had seen on his photo, were three simple words. You were the shadow. The threat was clear. She hadn't been a passenger. She had been a calculated variable in a highly sensitive transfer operation. Her existence on the flight was part of the camouflage, and now that the cargo was delivered and the exercise complete, the system was actively dissolving her memory of the event. They weren't just erasing the manifest. They were trying to erase the witness. Dana stopped writing about travel. She became obsessed with watching incoming flight patterns, knowing that somewhere, 30,000 feet above the unsuspecting population, a plane was flying its true, classified route, carrying its horrifying, contained cargo hidden in plain sight. The system erases records, cancels flights, and designates witnesses as irrelevant ballast. But what happens when the operation requires not just the movement of contained cargo, but the establishment of a full-scale, clandestine research station? When the void demands a permanent base of operations? My next file concerns a breach far more systemic, a terrifying example of a commercial flight being repurposed mid-air into something entirely different. The subject here is Jimmy Calder, a flight maintenance engineer whose expertise inadvertently pulled him into the mechanism of his own erasure. Jimmy was flying Ether Airways 228 from Frankfurt to Boston. He was not on duty, but was occupying a jump seat in the cockpit for the long-haul trip. He was chatting with the pilot, discussing maintenance cycles and fuel consumption, everything grounded, rational, and predictable. About 5 hours into the flight, while cruising somewhere over the Atlantic, the pilot excused himself for a moment. Jimmy, bored, began tracing the wiring schematics displayed on the main console, a habit of his. He noticed a discrepancy. A heavy-gauge power line marked auxiliary system, non-standard load leading down from the cockpit floor panel. He'd never seen that designation before on a passenger jet. Curiosity winning out, Jimmy knelt down. He found a small, almost invisible access hatch beneath the co-pilot's footrest, secured by a complex biometric lock he didn't recognize. This was a grounding fact of engineering horror. The plane contained structures that were entirely undocumented in the official schematics. It was an architectural ghost. As he examined the lock, the cockpit lights flickered, and the lock disengaged with a silent, hydraulic thunk. A draft of frigid air immediately flooded the cockpit. The panel swung open to reveal a narrow, brightly lit metal corridor descending sharply into the body of the plane. It was too deep, too long to fit within the known dimensions of the aircraft's belly. The space was impossible. Jimmy, armed with the irrational courage of absolute disorientation, slipped down into the passage. The corridor was stainless steel, antiseptic, and lined with pipes and conduits that hummed with quiet, contained power. It looked like the interior of a submarine. At the end of the corridor, the space opened into a small, pressurized room, a fully functioning, mobile laboratory. There were banks of computers running unfamiliar code, filtration systems, and, most chillingly, 2 heavy examination tables bolted to the floor. The temperature in here was near freezing. He saw 2 figures in full hazmat suits working silently, illuminated by harsh white light. They were monitoring complex vitals readouts, but the subjects of their attention were obscured by heavy privacy screens. "I need to report this," Jimmy whispered, fumbling for his radio. Before he could transmit, a voice spoke over the lab's internal intercom system, calm and authoritative. "Mr. Calder, Please return to the flight deck. Your presence is no longer required in sublevel Delta. Jimmy scrambled back up, adrenaline flooding his system. The hatch sealed instantly, the biometric lock clicking into place. He looked at the pilot, who had returned, but the pilot's eyes were dull, focused only on the instruments. What was that? Jimmy demanded. The pilot didn't look at him. Mr. Calder, please remain seated. We have experienced a slight deviation from the projected flight path. The deviation was catastrophic. Jimmy checked the GPS. They were no longer heading toward Boston. They were cruising directly over the vast, white emptiness of the Arctic Sea. The sun, which should have been rising on their port side, was low and diffused, painting the ice floes with colors that felt ancient and wrong. The plane began its descent, landing hours later, not at a major international hub, but on a temporary, snow-covered airstrip carved into an expanse of ice. As the plane came to a stop, the air temperature plummeted. A new team of men, dressed in Arctic gear, boarded immediately, moving not with the panicked urgency of the military, but with the cool efficiency of medical staff performing a scheduled procedure. They began calling names over the PA system. Not randomly. They called them out from the manifest one by one. Ms. Deloria, Mr. Vasquez, Mr. Calder. Jimmy realized the cockpit encounter hadn't been an accident. It was a scheduled transition. He was not a witness. He was a designated participant. He was escorted down the stairs onto the ice. The air was so cold it burned his lungs. He saw the other designated passengers, about 7 of them, standing shivering in their civilian clothes. They were all hooded immediately, their hands secured. The last thing Jimmy saw before the dark fabric dropped over his eyes was the tail of the plane, Ether 228. It didn't have the normal airline logo. It was painted with the silver double helix symbol he'd read about in the Ether 707 solo charter report. The symbol of Station Gamma. The transportation that followed was disorienting. Cold, movement, silence, the metallic tang of an enclosed space. When the hood was removed, Jimmy was standing on a cobblestone street in a small fishing town. The air smelled of salt and diesel. He was alone. His flight bag was sitting neatly at his feet. His identification, his passport, his pilot's license, his engineer's certification was gone. Every single piece of identification that tied him to his previous life had been incinerated. He was stateless, nameless. He later determined he was in a small, isolated village in Iceland. He eventually made his way to the nearest embassy and was immediately flagged as an anomaly. When the authorities ran his name against Ether Airways' manifest for Flight 228, the results were conclusive. Jimmy Calder does not exist on the flight log. His name had been erased not just from the passenger list, but from the maintenance crew logs for the entire year. The system had wiped his identity, leaving him physically intact, but legally invisible, a walking ghost. The reflective thought that consumed him then, and still echoes now, is chilling. The greatest form of control isn't incarceration. It's absolute systemic deletion. They didn't need to kill him. They just needed to ensure that no record of his existence or his knowledge of sublevel Delta could be verified by any digital or bureaucratic structure. Jimmy is now a man living off-grid in rural Iceland, working under a forged name. He knows that Ether 228 isn't a commercial liner. It's a mobile research platform, a speculative concept of a constantly moving, high-altitude laboratory, utilizing the isolation of the upper atmosphere and the neutrality of the North Pole to conduct its procedures on select, hooded participants. He knows that beneath every major international airline's veneer of normalcy, there might be a metal corridor leading straight into the void. The systemic control is almost absolute. They erase the manifests, they fake the landings, they wipe the memories, and they move the assets through hidden corridors. But sometimes, the anomaly is so profound, so fundamentally destabilizing, that it bleeds out into the edges of the system, terrifying the people whose jobs are to maintain the illusion of order. My next file concerns Sarah Chun, a ground operations supervisor for Zenith Airlines at the Denver hub. Sarah specialized in logistical flow, ensuring boarding procedures were smooth and security protocols were met. She was a master of the mundane, reliant on the clean, verifiable data of CCTV feeds and digital manifests. Her encounter took place during the boarding process for Zenith Domestic Flight 703, heading to Chicago. The scene was standard: a crowded gate, impatient travelers, the predictable rush of human movement. Sarah was monitoring the CCTV feed from her supervisory booth, specifically watching the jetway camera, the critical junction between the gate and the aircraft. That's where she first saw him. He was a man in a pale blue, slightly oversized sweater, carrying a single, worn briefcase. He was standing near the forward door of the aircraft, just inside the cabin entrance. The anomaly began when the footage showed the man in the blue sweater, moments later, sitting in seat 14A. Sarah checked the manifest. 14A was assigned to a Mrs. Hernandez, an older woman who had already boarded. Sarah zoomed in on the feed. The man was definitely in 14A. Mrs. Hernandez was now in 14B, looking confused, rearranging her carry-on. Then, the man in blue appeared again, suddenly, instantly, in seat 22C, a middle seat occupied by a large, sleeping man. The man in blue was simply there, partially superimposed over the sleeping passenger for a split second, then fully occupying the seat next to him, silent and motionless. He wasn't moving through the aisle. He was changing location instantaneously, a flicker between frames that defied velocity, geometry, and the laws of physics. Sarah watched, heart hammering against her ribs, as the man in blue continued his impossible migration. He went from 22C to 3A, then briefly, horrifyingly, he appeared to stand right in the middle of the crowded aisle, completely invisible to the flow of boarding passengers who walked right through his ethereal form. This was not a camera glitch, Sarah determined. The visual data was clean. This was a physical being capable of nonlinear movement, a speculative concept known in fringe quantum mechanics as spatial jitter, a localized failure of the dimensional constant. The horror peaked when the man in blue turned his attention to the cockpit. The door was closed, secured. The man walked directly toward the metallic panel, paused, and then simply entered it. Not through the lock, not through a secret hatch like on Ether 228, but through the solid material itself, dissolving into the metal skin and reforming on the other side. Sarah, hyperventilating, immediately reviewed the gate's CCTV feed, the footage of the general waiting area. She saw the man in the blue sweater there, standing patiently near a pillar, briefcase at his side. He was still standing there, even though he was simultaneously inside the plane, observing the cockpit. This entity, this grounding fact of pure logistical horror, was in two places at once. It was not a passenger, it was a surveyor. Sarah immediately red-flagged the plane. She called the gate manager, babbling about a security breach, an unauthorized person in the cockpit. The gate manager, exasperated, verified the manifest. 703 is fully boarded. Sarah, nothing abnormal. We're closing the doors now. Sarah rushed out of her booth and onto the jetway, demanding they hold the flight. She pounded on the cabin door. When she finally managed to board, she hurried down the aisle, checking 14A, 22C, and 3A. The seats were occupied by their assigned passengers. There was no man in a blue sweater. When she checked the cockpit, the pilot confirmed the lock was secured, the seal intact. No unauthorized personnel. Confused and shaken, Sarah returned to her office and pulled the digital manifest for Flight 703, cross-referencing the seat locations where she had observed the man. The seats he occupied, 14A, 22C, 3A, were all marked in the database not as assigned, but as unassigned/reservation error. The system had retroactively scrubbed those seats of identity. The passengers sitting there were suddenly ghosts in the machine, their seat assignments deemed invalid, their presence a fleeting error the system was correcting. Sarah's incident report triggered an immediate internal audit. The next day, she was called into a security hearing. They played back the CCTV feed for her. On the screen, the passengers boarded, the doors closed, and the plane departed. There was absolutely no trace of the man in the blue sweater moving through the aisle or entering the cockpit. The footage was pristine. The systemic cover-up was complete. Sarah's internal access to the manifest system was revoked immediately after the investigation was closed. The official findings stated she suffered from visual fatigue exacerbated by stress. But there was another anomaly, one she received late that night, hours after the incident. A direct message sent to her private employee terminal, bypassing all firewalls. It was from an anonymous source named HR. The message read, "When the system fails, look for the anomalies that defy logic. This is protection. Remember the number 24B." This cryptic warning was immediately followed by a chilling, tangential file from the Altitude Anomaly database, a story Sarah hadn't yet filed, concerning Flight 2217, where a nervous passenger named Kendall had been reassured by an elderly flight attendant named Helen Rowe. Helen had told Kendall, "No matter what, don't unbuckle your seatbelt," and then had vanished, only to be discovered later as a casualty of a crash years ago, specifically killed protecting a child in seat 24B. The realization settled on Sarah with suffocating weight. The man in the blue sweater, the entity, was surveying the system, locating breaches, marking passengers for correction. And the mysterious HR, the source of her protection, was a spectral network of those who had already been erased, reaching back through time to offer warnings. The people we lose in the void aren't gone. They're just operating on a different frequency. Sarah understood that the void was watching her now, too. She was a witness who knew about the seats that refused to be assigned and the entities that walked through solid steel. And she knew she had been given a lifeline, a spectral concept of a protective network fighting this silent erasure. Remember 24B. The man in the blue sweater, the T-class cargo, the plane frozen in the salt flats. These are all symptoms of a system that treats our airspace as an operational, non-human domain. But how does this operation communicate? If the void is actively consuming reality, what language does it speak? This final deep dive into the anomaly files brought me to the horrific case of Flight 709, a long-haul journey from New York to Reykjavik, where the communication was auditory, invasive, and potentially mind-altering. Jared Thorne was a brilliant, paranoid cybersecurity expert. He didn't trust commercial aviation systems, believing them to be inherently insecure. On board Northern Lights Flight 709, Jared wasn't reading a book. He was running unauthorized diagnostics on his laptop, monitoring the plane's internal communication networks using a custom-built directional antenna. He was hoping to find weak encryption or network vulnerabilities. What he found was much, much worse. Mid-flight, about 4 hours out over the frigid North Atlantic, the plane hit a period of violent, sustained turbulence. Not just bumps. This was an agonizing shudder, a physical violation of the hull, accompanied by a sound like tearing fabric that seemed to come from outside and inside simultaneously. The cabin lights flashed purple and red. Panic erupted. Jared, gripping his seat, saw passengers around him begin to experience nosebleeds. Children cried, and several adults slumped forward, entering a sudden, comatose state. He glanced out the window. The sky was the deepest indigo, but the horizon line was inverted. The ocean seemed to be curving upward, convex, as if they were flying inside a sphere that was collapsing upon itself. This visual impossibility, the sky turning upside down, was the grounding fact that confirmed the spatial anomaly. In that moment of maximum turbulence, Jared's directional antenna locked onto an internal broadcast frequency, a cockpit announcement that was not routed through the passenger speakers. It was a digital transmission, usually reserved for highly encoded, short-burst ground communications. Jared hit record. The sound was not human language. It was a rapid, clicking staccato overlaid with a guttural, resonant chirp. It sounded like cetaceans communicating through high-density static. The frequency was so low it vibrated the fillings in his teeth. He managed to keep recording for 45 seconds before the turbulence abruptly ceased. The lights flickered back to standard white, and the plane returned to its smooth, high-altitude glide. The passengers, still confused, slowly stirred, the nosebleeds stopping as quickly as they started. The comatose people blinked and woke up, confused, asking what they had missed. Jared knew they had not experienced turbulence. They had experienced a controlled, localized reality collapse, engineered to enable a high-frequency broadcast. When the plane landed safely in Reykjavik, the passengers were met with the practiced, sterile professionalism of the flight crew, who insisted it was just a patch of high-altitude wind shear. Nothing unusual. Jared immediately went to work in his hotel room, isolating the recorded audio clip. He ran it through a series of filters, trying to isolate the phonemes. The breakthrough came when he reversed the audio track and slowed the playback. The clicking static resolved into a recognizable, mathematically precise sequence of coordinates. He typed them into his GPS software. They corresponded exactly to the central locus of the Pacific anomaly, the same spot where Sean Elrod's wife's phone still periodically pinged, the middle of the South Pacific Ocean. Then, the reverse chirps resolved into two distinct, synthesized syllables, perfectly translated by the decryption software into English. They are waiting. This was the terrifying speculative concept of the consciousness broadcast. The plane wasn't experiencing a random event. It was traversing a specific vector where an external force used the aircraft's internal systems as a transmission relay. The human body, the nosebleeds, the comas, was reacting violently to the non-human data download, a physical manifestation of receiving impossible information. The upside-down sky was the visual effect of reality temporarily folding in response to the massive data transfer. Jared tried to share his discovery. He logged on to a secure forum he managed, posting the coordinates and the translated message. Within 10 minutes, his laptop screen went black. His phone, the phone containing the only copy of the original audio file, simply disappeared from his desk while he was looking away. A complete, clean digital and physical erasure of the evidence. When he searched the secure forum on another device, his post was gone. The entire thread was scrubbed, replaced with an admin notice, data corruption error, thread deleted. He found one user who had managed to screenshot the post before deletion. The user was terrified, writing, "I saw the coordinates. Who is they?" The reply beneath the screenshot was anonymous, cold, and utterly systemic. "Do not inquire further into Flight 709. Your manifest participation is complete." Jared understood the final, relentless nature of the cover-up. The airlines, the system, the void itself, they were not just erasing the records of the flight. They were policing the information after the flight, ensuring that anyone who saw the coordinates or heard the message was silenced. The sky wasn't safe, and the infrastructure of air travel was simply a massive, high-speed conduit for transmitting unsettling, existential warnings. Jared now lives in a perpetual state of digital paranoia, constantly looking over his shoulder, knowing that he briefly tapped into the communication system of the void. And he knows that somewhere, deep in the Pacific, or perhaps above it, they are waiting for the next data transfer. We have tracked the erasure, the silence, the ghost flights, the government seizures, the spectral surveyors, and the non-human broadcasts. The system is layered, efficient, and horrifyingly purposeful. The final piece of the Altitude Anomaly Files reveals the chilling logic behind who is taken and how the infrastructure of commercial travel facilitates the harvest. This brings us to Alina Vargas, a student traveling from Phoenix to Chicago. Alina was young, naive, and broke. She found a bizarrely cheap ticket, almost 90% off the standard fare, through an obscure, independent travel application called VoidLink Transit. The ticket was for Flight 867, operated by a small, unknown carrier named Skyway Logistics. The whole experience felt wrong from the moment she boarded. The plane was old, the interior worn, and the air had a persistent, oily scent. Her ticket, which she had printed, specified row 18, seat D. The most profound visual anomaly was the curtain. Precisely at row 20, a thick, dark velvet curtain was drawn across the aisle, completely separating the front of the plane from the back. The front section, where Alina sat, was lit with standard, pale yellow cabin lights. The area behind the curtain, however, emitted a dim, unsettling green glow. The passengers in the front were mostly older business travelers, absorbed in tablets or sleeping. The passengers in the back, the ones who boarded after her, were overwhelmingly young, traveling alone, clutching worn backpacks. They looked lost, disconnected, their eyes wide with a peculiar, blank resignation. This distinct class separation gave rise to the chilling speculative concept of the T-class manifest. The ticket Alina bought was cheap not because of mechanical issues, but because it placed her directly adjacent to the mechanism of extraction. She was in the buffer zone. The flight was smooth, silent, and entirely forgettable until the landing in Chicago. The plane taxied for an impossible length of time, bypassing the main terminals. It finally stopped at a remote, dimly lit section of the airfield, surrounded by high chain-link fences. The captain's voice came over the PA, startlingly loud. "Welcome to Chicago. Passengers in rows 1 to 19, please prepare to disembark through the forward gate." And then, the second announcement, delivered by a flight attendant from the rear of the plane, near the curtain. "Passengers in rows 20 and above, please remain seated until cleared for the auxiliary exit." Alina watched as the front passengers quickly filed out. As the curtain was finally, slowly pulled back, the scene behind it was horrifyingly efficient. The passengers from row 20 onward were moving, single file, toward the rear service door, a door usually reserved for catering and cleaning crews. The green light bathed their faces, making them look sickly and spectral. They walked with a hypnotic slowness, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Two men in dark, unbranded uniforms stood by the rear door, checking a tablet. As each passenger reached them, the men simply nodded, and the person stepped out onto the tarmac. Alina tried to look out the window, but the glass was frosted on that side. As she disembarked through the front, she caught a glimpse of what was waiting outside the rear exit. It wasn't a jetway. It was a sterile, white passenger van, completely unmarked, without a visible license plate, its engine idling. The young people from the back of the plane were being silently ushered into the back of the van. A young flight attendant, passing Alina, leaned in and whispered, "Forget what you saw. It was a special medical transfer." Alina stood at the main gate, watching the arrivals board. Skyway Logistics 867 was listed, but there was an asterisk, partial arrival confirmation. She filed an informal query later that day, asking about the status of the passengers behind row 20. She got a standard email reply from Skyway Logistics Corporate. All manifested passengers on Flight 867 arrived safely and completed their scheduled transfers. But Alina was a student of data security. She used an old university login to access the public FAA arrival manifest for that date. The list of passengers disembarking and clearing security only contained names from rows 1 through 19. The names of the people who were ushered into the white van had been completely deleted from the arrival records. They had entered the commercial air system, flown 1,800 miles, and then vanished into the digital void the moment they stepped into the auxiliary transfer. This was the final, devastating grounding fact. The system doesn't just erase evidence. It runs a parallel, invisible commercial operation designed purely for extraction. The cheap tickets, the unknown carrier, the segregated cabin. It was all a sophisticated form of aerial trafficking. Alina's reflective thought was one of chilling vulnerability. If you can buy a ticket into the void for $50, what is your life actually worth to the people running the system? Alina attempted to access the VoidLink Transit app to find her ticket stub. The app was gone. The website URL led to a park domain page. Digital erasure had consumed the entire operation. A week later, a thick, linen envelope arrived at her apartment. No return address. Inside, there was no red ink, no coded message, just a professionally typed, perfect letter. It contained a single sentence, a chilling confirmation of her status as an accidental witness, and a threat. You were never in row 18. Your memory will conform to the manifest. The threat wasn't physical, it was existential. They weren't going to harm her body. They were going to systematically dismantle her reality until she believed the lie that the flight had been normal, and that row 20 had always been empty. She was just a buffer, but now, she was scheduled for memory integration, just like Arthur Vance. The 9 stories all echo the same, terrifying truth. The airspace is compromised. The routine of commercial flight is the perfect cover. People are taken, systems are manipulated, and the only proof that any of it happened is the gnawing sense of dread carried by the few, targeted witnesses who were just close enough to the curtain to glimpse the dark geometry beyond. The void is not outside the plane. It has incorporated itself into the manifest. The static is receding, the air in the room is settling, and the sound of the rising sun is a lie, a cheerful deceit over the terror we just shared. You heard the reports, fragments pulled from a defunct FAA audit, stitched together from the paranoia of men and women who dared to look past the turbulence warning. 9 instances of systemic failure, where the sky ceased to be a pathway and became a hunting ground. Arthur Vance, seeing time freeze at 1:14 a.m. Eli Carr, finding the plane that defied decay, with its warning of not your sky. Sean Elrod, witnessing his wife's descent into the deep Pacific anomaly. Dana Roth, realizing she was merely human packaging for classified cargo. Jimmy Calder, forced into the secret mobile lab beneath the fuselage. Sarah Chun, watching the surveyor move through solid steel. Jared Thorne, recording the non-human coordinates broadcast across the void. And Alina Vargas, witnessing the chilling, methodical removal of the T-class passengers into the white, unmarked van. They all share the same fate, systemic erasure. Their careers ruined, their memories assaulted, their identities neutralized.